The wind howled like a wounded beast, sweeping across the desolate expanse of red dunes and jagged rock formations. A lone figure stood at the edge of a crumbling plateau, his tattered coat whipping against his frail body. Edward Lancaster had not spoken a word to another living soul in over 5 years. He had come here to disappear, to let the silence of this barren world drown out the echoes of his past. The planet, officially designated as XZ397, was nothing more than a forgotten outpost on the edge of human-explored space. It was a place where only the desperate or the damned chose to reside. Edward belonged to the latter. Once, he had been a brilliant aerospace engineer, a man whose hands had helped shape the future of space travel. But all of that had lost meaning the day his wife, Eleanor, had died. Cancer. Slow, merciless, and indifferent to all his knowledge and efforts. Her absence had hollowed him out, turning his existence into a mere sequence of days blending into one another. So, he had left Earth. Left behind the well-meaning condolences, the empty platitudes, and the crushing weight of memories. Out here, under an alien sky, he was free to fade away in solitude. But solitude had its own challenges. The atmosphere of XZ397 was thin, its oxygen levels barely sustainable. The terrain was ruthless, with dust storms capable of stripping flesh from bone. Edward had learned to survive, scavenging supplies from abandoned research stations and reinforcing his makeshift shelter in a valley between towering rock formations. The only connection he had to the outside world was a small relay station a few kilometers from his camp, a lifeline he seldom used. Until today. The storm arrived without warning. One moment, the sky was an endless stretch of violet and amber. The next, it had turned a sickly shade of gray, swirling with fine, razor-sharp sand. The winds came first, rattling his shelter like a dying animal in its death throes. Then, the full force of the storm hit. Edward had been through storms before, but this one was different. It was stronger, angrier. The old relay station, which had stood resilient for decades, gave way with a sickening crack. Sparks flew as cables snapped, and the entire structure collapsed into a heap of twisted metal and shattered equipment. Cursing under his breath, Edward knew he had no choice but to move. Staying in his shelter was no longer an option without the relay station. He had lost his only means of emergency communication. If something went wrong, no one would come for him. Not that anyone would have come before, but the illusion of safety had been something to cling to. He packed what little he could carry: ration packs, a water canister, a portable oxygen unit, and his old revolver. The weapon was more for comfort than practicality. There were no wild animals here, no native predators that he had encountered. But in an unpredictable world, old habits died hard. With his pack secured, Edward stepped out into the storm, bracing against the howling winds. Visibility was nearly non-existent, the sand slashing at his exposed skin like 1,000 tiny blades. He kept his head down, moving with slow, deliberate steps, navigating by memory more than sight. Then he saw it. A shadow amidst the storm, half buried in the shifting sands. At first, he thought it was debris from the relay station, but as he approached, his heart skipped a beat. It was a person. Or at least, something close to one. The figure lay motionless, their form barely discernible beneath layers of dust and sand. Edward hesitated. He had not seen another living being in years. He had resigned himself to solitude, yet here was proof that he was not as alone as he had believed. Kneeling beside the figure, he brushed away the sand, revealing smooth, pale skin beneath. Their features were delicate, almost ethereal, and their eyes half open glowed with a strange silver light, reflecting the dim embers of the storm's dying flames. Not human. Edward's breath caught in his throat. He had read about them, heard the rumors. The Veneri. A species rarely seen, even rarer to encounter face to face. They were observers, never interferers. But why was one here? And why were they alone? The alien's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. Alive, but barely. Edward reached out, pressing his fingers against their neck. The pulse was weak, but steady. Against every instinct telling him to walk away, to leave the creature to its fate, Edward sighed and muttered under his breath, "Damn it." He hoisted the limp body over his shoulder and turned back toward his shelter, disappearing into the storm. The storm howled outside, a furious beast clawing at the fragile shelter Edward had pieced together over the years. The thin metal walls rattled, sand hissing against them like whispers of forgotten ghosts. Inside, dim firelight flickered across the uneven floor, illuminating the frail form of the being he had just rescued. She, if she could be called that, lay motionless on the tattered cot, her breath shallow, her silver eyes closed. Edward had seen many things in his long life, but never had he encountered someone quite like her. Her skin was an iridescent hue, shifting slightly under the dim light, and her fingers, long and delicate, twitched as though even in unconsciousness she was wary of her surroundings. Edward sat beside the cot, his weary bones aching from the effort of dragging her through the storm. He hadn't thought, hadn't he planned, just acted. Like instinct. Like the way he used to care for Margaret, his late wife, when she had fallen ill all those years ago. The memory stung, but he pushed it aside, focusing on the task at hand. He had wrapped the stranger in a thermal blanket, cleaned the wound on her leg, and checked for any signs of infection. He was no doctor, but his years as an engineer in deep space had taught him enough about survival. A gust of wind made the shelter groan, and the fire wavered. Edward turned to his guest, watching for any sign of wakefulness. She was breathing steadily now, her chest rising and falling in a slow rhythm. That was good. He didn't know what she was, but she was alive. And that was enough for now. He moved away, giving her space, and settled into his usual chair by the fire. The chair creaked under his weight as he leaned back, exhaling slowly. His hands ached, years of labor, years of loss, and now, this. A stranger in his home, in the middle of a wasteland on a planet that barely felt like his own. The storm raged for hours, and Edward dozed in and out of a light sleep, the crackling fire and the rhythmic wind forming a lullaby of sorts. He was used to the silence, to the solitude. He had chosen it. Yet, for the first time in years, there was another presence in the room, another breath besides his own. Then a sound. Soft. Barely audible over the wind. A shift of fabric, a sharp intake of breath. Edward opened his eyes. The stranger was awake. She sat up slowly, her movements stiff, and her silver eyes, now open, darted around the room. The fire cast a warm glow on her face, highlighting the alien contours of her features. Edward remained still, allowing her to take in her surroundings. He knew better than to startle a wounded creature. She looked down at her leg, the rough bandage he had wrapped around it. Her fingers hesitated before brushing over the fabric, testing the injury. Then, cautiously, she turned her gaze to him. Neither spoke. Edward simply watched her, his expression unreadable, his tired blue eyes meeting her cautious silver ones. He had no questions, not yet. She was alive, and that was enough. Her fingers curled into the blanket around her, as if grounding herself in something tangible. Her lips parted, but no words came. She tried again, her voice raw, foreign, barely a whisper. Where? Edward's brows furrowed slightly. Her accent was thick, her pronunciation unfamiliar, but he understood. He hesitated before answering. Safe. She studied him, as if weighing the truth of that single word. The fire crackled between them. Her shoulders remained tense, but she made no move to flee. Edward sighed and leaned forward, rubbing his hands together. You were caught in a storm, he said after a moment. Bad shape. I brought you here. Again, she was silent. Then, slowly, she nodded. A long pause stretched between them. Edward could feel the unspoken questions in the air, but he didn't push. He knew what it was like to wake up in an unfamiliar place, surrounded by uncertainty. He knew what it was like to be lost. Instead of pressing her for answers, he rose stiffly from his chair and moved toward a small crate where he kept his provisions. He poured a small cup of water and placed it near her on the cot. Drink, he said simply. She hesitated, then reached out. Her fingers brushed the cup, then withdrew, as if testing his intentions. Finally, she picked it up and took a small sip. Edward sat back down, watching as she drank. She was wary, but not hostile. That was a good sign. He had no idea where she had come from, what had happened to her, or why she had been alone in the middle of a storm. But he recognized the look in her eyes. The look of someone who had lost something. He had seen it in the mirror for years. They sat in silence for a long time, the storm beginning to die outside. Edward didn't speak again, didn't push for explanations. He simply sat, letting the fire warm the space between them, and allowed the presence of another living soul to settle into the quiet corners of his world. The days that followed were wrapped in a quiet neither of them dared to break. The wind howled through the canyons, sweeping fine grains of sand against the metal walls of the shelter, but inside, silence reigned. Edward went about his days as he always had, methodical, measured, unhurried. He maintained the solar panels, repaired the water collector, and checked the supply caches he had hidden over the years. Ra watched. At first, she did so from a distance, wrapped in a tattered emergency blanket he had given her. She sat in the corner of his small shelter, silver eyes tracking his movements like an animal assessing whether a stranger was predator or prey. Edward paid her no mind. He had spent too many years alone to force company upon someone unwilling. Instead, he simply went about his work, occasionally setting out food and water in the quiet offer of hospitality. Days passed. The wariness between them did not entirely fade, but it softened at the edges. Ra was careful, cautious, but curious. When Edward adjusted the energy cells, she would lean forward slightly, her gaze flicking between his hands and the machine. When he rewired a damaged power relay, she would tilt her head as though listening to the hum of energy. It reminded him of his wife, how she used to watch him work on their small home back on Earth, fascinated by the way he could fix things with his hands. The thought of her sent a pang through his chest, sharp and unexpected. One evening, as he sat by the fire outside, repairing an old filtration unit, he glanced up and found Ross standing at the doorway. She was watching him again, but this time, something had changed. Her expression wasn't just cautious, it was contemplative, as if she were piecing something together. Edward met her gaze briefly before returning to his work. He didn't ask her what she was thinking. He knew, better than most, that some thoughts took time before they could be shared. The quiet rhythm of their days continued. Edward gathered supplies from his hidden caches in the cliffs, always leaving extra rations behind should he need them in the future. Ra began to follow at a distance. She never interfered, never spoke, but she was there, always watching, always learning. One afternoon, as Edward sat outside reinforcing the windbreak around the shelter, Ra approached closer than she ever had before. She crouched beside him, tilting her head as she studied his work. Then, to his surprise, she reached out and picked up a tool. Edward said nothing. He simply continued, allowing her to observe. After a few moments, she mimicked his actions, carefully fitting a piece of metal reinforcement into place. He didn't correct her, didn't take the tool from her hands. He let her figure it out, let her take part in the work in her own way. That evening, as he handed her a bowl of food, she hesitated. Then, for the first time, she met his eyes directly and gave a small nod of acknowledgement, maybe even gratitude. Edward didn't press for more. He simply nodded back. It was on the 7th day that she finally broke the silence. Edward was inside, sorting through the last of his medical supplies, when he heard a voice, uncertain but deliberate. Thank you. He froze. Slowly, he turned. Ra was standing near the doorway, her silver eyes locked onto his. Her lips pressed together as if testing the shape of the words she had just spoken. Her voice was rough, the pronunciation strange, but there was no mistaking what she had said. Edward felt something tighten in his chest. It had been a long time since he had heard another voice in his home, longer still since someone had spoken to him not out of duty, but choice. He studied her for a long moment before giving a slow nod. "You're welcome." Ra exhaled, as if she had been holding her breath, and then, without another word, she turned away and stepped back into the night. Edward sat in the quiet for a long time, staring at the place where she had stood, listening to the wind stir the sand outside. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of something beginning. The fire crackled softly in the corner of the shelter, casting flickering shadows across the metal walls. Edward sat across from Ra, watching her with quiet patience. Since their first spoken words, the air between them had shifted, no longer a void of uncertainty but something fragile, something waiting to be understood. Ra ran her fingers over a piece of worn fabric, her silver eyes distant as if looking at something beyond the confines of their temporary refuge. Finally, she exhaled and began to speak. "My people, the Veneri, we do not see the world as you do," she said slowly, her voice still carrying the hesitancy of someone shaping foreign words. "We do not rely on sight. We feel sound. We feel energy." Edward frowned slightly, intrigued. "You can sense sound?" She nodded. "Not just hear. Feel. The way the air shifts when you move, the way the earth vibrates when you step. We understand the world through echoes, through the way everything speaks without words." Edward sat back, absorbing this. It explained the way she carried herself, always listening, always tilting her head in that strange, searching way. He had assumed it was caution, but now he understood. She was perceiving the world in a way he never could. After a pause, she continued. "I was sent here as a researcher. My people have watched yours for a long time, from a distance. We were never meant to make contact." Edward's lips pressed into a thin line. "But you did." A shadow crossed her expression. "The storm, it separated me from my team. I do not know if they survived." Her voice was steady, but Edward could hear the undercurrent of uncertainty, of loss. It was a feeling he knew too well. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind howled outside, rattling the shelter's walls. Finally, Edward reached for the kettle beside the fire, pouring a measure of tea into 2 metal cups. He handed one to Ra, who hesitated before accepting it. The warmth seeped into her fingers, grounding her. "I came here because I lost someone too," Edward admitted. His voice was low, almost swallowed by the wind outside. My wife. Ra's gaze lifted, searching his face. He did not look at her, only at the swirling liquid in his cup. After she passed, I left Earth. Didn't want to be around people. Didn't want to be reminded of what I lost. He let out a short, humorless chuckle. Never thought I'd end up playing host to an alien guest. A flicker of something passed through Ra's expression, understanding, perhaps. She had spent her life studying humans, but here, in this moment, she was not an observer. She was simply someone who had lost everything, speaking to someone who had done the same. Edward glanced at her. You said your people don't usually interact with humans. She nodded. It is forbidden. We are only meant to listen. And yet, here you are. She was silent for a moment before murmuring, and yet, here I am. The fire crackled between them, filling the space with a warmth neither of them had known for a long time. Edward sipped his tea, lost in thought. Ra traced patterns on the rim of her cup, as if trying to map the future the way she once mapped the echoes of the past. They were two remnants, two lost souls, bound by chance in a world that neither of them truly belonged to. And for the first time in years, Edward didn't feel entirely alone. Outside, the desert winds carried away the echoes of their shared silence. The night was still. Outside, the wind whispered through the jagged rock formations, a soft murmur against the silence inside the shelter. Edward sat near the fire, absently running a hand over the rim of his tin cup. Across from him, Ra sat with her legs drawn up, her silver eyes reflecting the dim glow of the embers. She had spoken little since that first halting attempt at human words. Not out of fear, nor distrust, there was something else. A hesitation that seemed rooted deeper than mere unfamiliarity. Edward had seen wounds before. Some left scars. Others, the worst ones, never quite healed because they were never quite seen. Your people, Edward said at last, breaking the quiet. You don't speak much, do you? Ra exhaled slowly, as if weighing her answer. Not, as you do. Her words were careful, her accent uneven but improving. Speaking too much changes things. Edward frowned slightly. Changes what? For a moment, she was silent, her gaze dropping to her hands. Then, with deliberate slowness, she said, emotion, is danger? Edward's fingers tightened around his cup. He had expected many things from her, but not this. Danger. She nodded. We Veneri feel through sound, through energy. Words, emotions, they ripple. Too much, and it unbalances. Edward let her words settle between them. He thought of all the times he had swallowed his grief, the years spent speaking only to the desert winds because words seemed too heavy to bear. He understood, in a way, what she meant. Some wounds, once voiced, could never be contained again. Still, he shook his head slightly. Holding everything in, that's no way to live. Ra studied him. It is the only way we know. He sighed. Maybe. But it doesn't have to be. She tilted her head slightly, curious but skeptical. You do not hide pain. Edward let out a dry chuckle. Oh, I do. I have. But my wife, she had a way of seeing right through it. His voice softened as he spoke, his thoughts drifting back to memories long buried. She never needed me to explain. Never asked for words I couldn't give. She just knew. And sometimes, just having someone there, not trying to fix anything, not demanding anything, that was enough. Ra was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled between them, the warmth of fragile bridge across the space they shared. Was she, like you? Ra finally asked. Edward smiled faintly. No. She was better. Ra seemed to absorb this, contemplating something unspoken. Then, she said, you lost her. It wasn't a question. It was a truth she had pieced together from his silence, his solitude, the way his hands lingered over the past as if trying to grasp something no longer there. Edward nodded. A long time ago. Feels like another life. Another silence settled, but this one was different. It was not the heavy silence of strangers. It was something shared, something understood. You, he asked, though he already suspected the answer. Ra's expression did not change, but there was something in the way her fingers curled slightly, as if grasping at something invisible. I cannot go back. Edward looked at her then, really looked at her. A being stranded in a world not her own, carrying a past she could never return to. And he an old man who had long ago chosen to leave his own behind. A man with no home. A woman with no way home. Two lost souls, adrift in a world of sand and silence. For the first time, Edward found himself saying the words he had never spoken aloud. I don't know if there's anything left for me to go back to either. Ra did not answer. But in the flickering firelight, she inclined her head ever so slightly, an acknowledgement that words were not always needed. And in that moment, neither of them felt quite so alone. The fire crackled softly in the dim light of the shelter, shadows flickering across the sand-worn walls. Edward sat with his back against the cold metal, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edges of an old, worn-out map. Ra sat across from him, her silver eyes reflecting the flames, but there was something distant in them tonight, something unsettled. If they find me? She finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm, I will be judged. Edward looked up, frowning. Judged? For what? She hesitated, fingers tightening around the fabric of her cloak. For breaking the rule. My people do not interfere. We observe, we learn, but we do not touch, we do not speak, we do not exist in your world. But I did. I crossed the line. Edward exhaled, rubbing his temples. He had suspected as much. There had always been something guarded about Ra, as if she had been carrying a secret too heavy for one soul. And now, it was clear her very presence with him was a crime in the eyes of her people. What happens if they find you? He asked carefully. She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze drifted to the entrance of the shelter, where the desert winds whispered against the metal frame. Exile. Or worse. They may erase me. Make it as if I never existed. The weight of her words settled in the silence between them. Edward knew what it meant to lose everything, to be forgotten by the world. He had chosen to leave his life behind, but for her, it wouldn't be a choice. Then we have to leave, he said firmly. Before they come. Ra blinked, her expression unreadable. Leave? To where? Edward unfolded the map and pointed to a small, barely legible marking several kilometers away. There's an old relay station out in the northern dunes. It was abandoned years ago, but if it still works, we might be able to send a distress signal or... He hesitated. Wipe any trace of you from their systems. Her silver eyes widened slightly. Erase me. If it means keeping you safe, then yes. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire continued its slow, steady burn, casting moving patterns against the walls. Finally, Ra nodded. Then we go. The journey began before dawn. The desert was treacherous, its landscape shifting with each gust of wind, making it nearly impossible to navigate without careful attention. Edward led the way, his pace steady but cautious, while Ra followed close behind, her movements near soundless in the sand. The air grew colder as they approached the northern dunes, an unnatural chill settling over the land. Edward knew this place. It was where storms gathered, where old things were buried beneath layers of dust and time. As the sun rose, the outline of the relay station came into view. It was a skeletal structure, rusted and half-buried, its once functioning antenna now broken and twisted. Edward felt a pang of doubt. What if it no longer worked? What if this had all been for nothing? They reached the entrance, forcing their way through a partially collapsed doorway. Inside, the station was eerily silent. The control panels were covered in dust, the air thick with the scent of rust and decay. Edward moved quickly, searching for the main terminal. If anything still had power, it would be here. Ra stood by the doorway, her eyes scanning the horizon. How long will this take? Edward didn't look up. Not long. If the core system is intact, I can reroute. A sharp beeping interrupted him. His heart clenched. The system was online, but not in the way he had hoped. Someone had already activated it. Damn it, he muttered, fingers flying over the controls. The interface was sluggish, as if it had been dormant for too long. But there it was, an incoming signal, faint but unmistakable. They are looking for me? Ra's voice was barely above a whisper. Edward's mind raced. He had two options: send a distress signal in the hope that anyone on the human frequencies would respond, or completely erase Ra's data before her people could track her location. There was no time to hesitate. What do you want to do? He asked, turning to her. She stared at him, conflict evident in her expression. If we erase me, I can never go back. But if we send a distress signal, it might bring them faster. Edward swallowed hard. And if we do nothing? Ra's lips pressed together. They will find me? The weight of the decision settled between them. For the first time in years, Edward was faced with a choice that truly mattered. Did he try to return to humanity, to seek help and face whatever consequences came with it? Or did he bury them both in the sands of this world, ensuring Ra's safety at the cost of everything else? The screen flickered, awaiting his command. Edward's fingers hovered over the keys, his heart pounding. He had made his choice. The desert stretched endlessly before them, an ocean of golden sand under the twin suns. Edward and Ra moved carefully, their footprints swallowed almost instantly by the shifting dunes. The old relay station loomed in the distance, its silhouette jagged against the pale sky. Edward felt his breath hitch as they approached. It had been years since he last saw a piece of human technology still standing in this desolate world. The rusted exterior showed signs of abandonment, but as he pushed open the door, the air inside was cool and heavy with dust. Ra followed silently, her silver eyes scanning every shadow. Is it still functional? She asked, her voice hushed. Edward moved towards the main console, brushing off a layer of grime. The screen flickered to life, sluggish but operational. His fingers danced over the controls, searching for a signal. Yes, he murmured, eyes narrowing. It still works. A small green light blinked, a sign that the station's transmitter was active. Edward could send a message back to Earth. He could call for help. But the thought made his stomach twist. Ra stood beside him, watching. Will you contact your people? Edward hesitated. I don't know. Years ago, he had left Earth behind, running from memories too painful to bear. But now, Standing before a working transmitter, the question loomed over him, did he have anything left to return to? And you, he asked, turning to Ra. What will you do? She looked away. If I send a signal, my people will come for me. But I have broken our most sacred law. Would they harm you? She exhaled slowly. Perhaps. Or they may erase my existence, as if I never lived. Edward felt a pang in his chest. He knew what it was to feel like a ghost, to exist in the margins of the universe. They were both lost souls, caught between worlds they could never truly belong to. A silence settled between them. Then, with a slow breath, Edward reached for the console. He could erase the logs, wipe any trace of Ra's presence from the system. Or he could send a message to Earth, reaching out to a past he wasn't sure he wanted anymore. He glanced at Ra, and for the first time, he saw something familiar in her expression: fear, uncertainty, but also a quiet resolve. In that moment, they were no longer two strangers bound by circumstance. They were something more. A family forged in the emptiness of the cosmos. Edward's fingers hovered over the controls. Whatever choice they made, it would define them forever. He took a deep breath and pressed a key. The silence inside the relay station was heavier than the desert air outside. The screen before Edward still flickered, waiting for a command. One push of a button, and he could send a signal back to Earth. One more, and he could erase any trace of Ra from the system, ensuring that her people would never find her. But he did neither. Instead, he let out a slow breath and leaned back against the rusted console. Ra stood beside him, her silver eyes reflecting the dim glow of the screen. She didn't speak, but she didn't have to. She was waiting for his choice, and for her own. I'm not sending it, Edward said finally, his voice quiet but firm. I have nothing left to go back to. Ra's lips parted slightly, surprise flickering across her face. You could return to your kind. To your world. He shook his head. My world is gone. My wife, my life before this, it's all buried under years of dust. He turned to her, eyes searching. But what about you? If we don't send a signal, you can't go back either. She was silent for a long moment, gazing at the screen as if it held the answer. Then, finally, she spoke. I don't want to go back. Edward's brow furrowed. But your people? My people would erase me? Her voice was steady, but there was something deep beneath it, a quiet pain. I broke their rules. I felt things I was not supposed to feel. I spoke when I should have remained silent. If I return, I will cease to be Ra. Edward exhaled, nodding slowly. They were the same, then. Two souls without a place, without a past to return to. Two beings who had chosen a path they could never retrace. Then we need to leave, he said, straightening. Before someone else finds this signal and comes looking. Ra hesitated. Where will we go? Edward pulled up a faded map on the screen, his fingers tracing the lines of an old trade route. There's a place, he murmured. An old outpost, abandoned years ago. It's far enough from any tracking systems, deep in the western canyons. If we make it there, we can disappear. Ra studied the map, then looked at Edward. For the first time since they met, she smiled, not a forced, cautious smile, but something real. Then let's disappear? The journey was long and grueling. The desert stretched before them in endless waves, shifting underfoot with each step. The twin suns burned mercilessly overhead, and at night, the cold crept into their bones. But they kept moving. Edward led the way, his instincts guiding him through the barren landscape. Ra followed, moving as silently as the wind. At times, she would pause, tilting her head as if listening to something he couldn't hear. He had learned to trust her senses. More than once, she had steered him away from hidden dangers, a buried sinkhole, a lurking predator in the distance. Days passed in a blur of sand and exhaustion, but then, at last, they spotted the outpost. A cluster of weathered structures stood half buried in the sand, their walls worn but intact. The wind howled through broken windows, and the air smelled of rust and time. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. It was theirs. Edward stepped inside the largest building, brushing dust from an old control panel. Nothing worked, of course, but that didn't matter. He turned to Ra, who stood in the doorway, eyes scanning the horizon one last time. "No regrets?" he asked. She met his gaze, her silver eyes steady. "None." Edward nodded, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of peace. He wasn't a man lost in the stars anymore. He wasn't a ghost of the past. He was here, now, with someone who had made the same choice. They had no home to return to, no past to cling to. But together, they had a future. And for the first time in years, that was enough. 3 weeks had passed since Edward and Ra arrived at the old outpost. Time had lost its urgency, slipping by like grains of sand in the wind. The rhythm of their days had settled into something steady, something almost peaceful. Edward spent his time repairing the outpost's power system. The solar panels were buried under layers of dust, their surfaces cracked but still salvageable. It was slow work, but he welcomed the routine. The focus it demanded kept his mind from drifting too far into the past. With each fixed circuit, each flickering light brought back to life, the outpost became more of a home. Ra, on the other hand, had taken to exploring the surrounding terrain. She carried an old tablet she had salvaged from the station, using it to sketch maps of the region. At first, her drawings were crude, just rough outlines of the canyon walls and the dunes that stretched beyond. But over time, her lines became more refined, more intricate. She wasn't just mapping the land, she was learning its language. She also recorded sounds: the shifting wind, the distant cries of unseen creatures, the hum of the earth beneath her feet. Her people had always relied on sound and energy to understand the world, but now, she was doing something different. She was not merely observing from a distance, she was becoming part of it. One evening, as the sky turned to liquid gold, Ra sat on the edge of a rocky ledge, tablet in hand. Edward approached, wiping the sweat from his brow, and settled beside her. "What are you drawing now?" he asked, peering at the screen. She turned it toward him. The sketch was a work in progress, but he could already see what it was: a map of their journey. Not just the land, but their steps, their choices, the places they had rested. It was a story told in lines and symbols, one only she could read fully. "You're mapping more than just the terrain," he noted. She nodded. "I am mapping us." Edward let out a quiet chuckle. "Didn't think I'd end up as a landmark." She tilted her head, studying him. "You are not a landmark. You are a path." He frowned slightly. "A path?" She hesitated, then placed a hand over her chest. "I was meant to observe, to collect knowledge, but never to belong. That was the rule. But I chose differently. I chose to stay. And now, I am not just an observer. I am walking a path. You are walking it too." Edward stared out at the horizon, letting her words settle. He had spent so long drifting, lost in memories of the past, believing he had nowhere left to go. But here, In this strange place, with this strange companion, he had found something unexpected, a purpose. For the first time in years, he was not waiting for something to end. He was moving forward. The night settled in, and the stars unfolded above them, unbound by walls or borders. Ra traced unseen patterns in the sky, murmuring in her native tongue, while Edward simply listened. There was nothing left to run from. Nothing left to regret. For the first time in a long, long while, he was not alone. The morning sun rose over the desolate landscape, painting the sky in hues of amber and crimson. The air was crisp, untouched by the weight of past regrets or the burden of uncertain tomorrows. Edward stood outside the outpost, his gaze fixed on the endless horizon, the vast openness that had once felt suffocating but now felt liberating. Ra approached quietly, her movements barely disturbing the silence. She stood beside him, her silver eyes reflecting the morning light. For a long moment, they simply existed there, side by side, without the need for words. Then, breaking the stillness, Ra spoke. "Do you regret not going back to Earth?" Edward turned his head slightly, looking at her with a soft smile. The question was simple, but the weight behind it was not. He let the silence stretch, considering his answer before he finally spoke. "If I had gone back, I would be nothing more than an old man waiting to die." His voice was steady, filled with quiet certainty. "But here, I am alive." Ra studied him for a moment, as if absorbing his words in a way deeper than mere comprehension. She placed a hand lightly against her chest, feeling the steady rhythm beneath her fingertips. "I do not know what love means to humans," she admitted, her voice almost a whisper. "But if it feels like this warmth, this presence, then I believe I have found it." Edward's gaze softened. He didn't need to respond with words. Instead, he simply nodded, acknowledging the unspoken truth between them. Love did not require a name, nor did it need to fit within the confines of definition. It was there, in the quiet companionship, in the choices they had made for each other, in the way neither of them felt alone anymore. The wind stirred the sand around them, a gentle whisper through the dunes. The past no longer held them, and the future was unwritten. But in that moment, standing beneath an unfamiliar sky on an uncharted world, they were exactly where they belonged. Two souls, once lost, had found a home not in a place, but in each other.